The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Project Nerd as a whole. Should we just go ahead and say it? 2020 was a rough year. And with the way 2021 has started, it doesn't look like it's getting any easier anytime soon. Along with this pandemic, political issues that are, well beyond politics, and the open embracing of racism in this country, another matter that many seem less pressing also seems to be eating up headlines, and that's student loans. At the end of 2020, the student loan debt in the United States is greater than $1.71 trillion, and that debt grows 6 times faster than the nation's economy. More than 43.2 million student borrowers are in debt by an average of nearly $40,000 each. And these numbers don't even include the billions in private student loans still to be paid back as well. The matter has become a national crisis. Yes, a crisis so big that in an election year last year, with so many matters to discuss, the politicians kept going back to student loans. And even the most conservative of liberals, President Joe Biden, included some form of relief on his agenda. Well, Biden has only had 3 months to do anything at this point, and he's had plenty of other pressing matters on his plate. But his inability to act already has millions up in arms. And as those pleading and asking for forgiveness get louder, so does the group that finds this mass forgiveness possibility to be an issue. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the student loan debt issue plaguing the United States. We're going to take a look at arguments for and against. We're going to talk about types of forgiveness, and I'm going to give my opinion on what we should do. And before we do all that, we're going to look at some data. But let's play the intro, because we're here on Project Nerd's Diving Deep.
I could let them know about the sorrow and the happiness that the future has in store for them. Maybe they could learn from it.
Let's dive deep.
Let's dive right in.
We're gonna dive deep into this.
Let's deep dive into this.
This is Diving Deep.
This is Diving Deep.
This is Diving Deep.
Since 1971, the average cost of a higher education has increased by 145%. And according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, between 2004 and 2014, there was a 74% increase in student loan balances. And as previously stated, at the end of 2020, 45 million borrowers owe an approximate $1.7 trillion in federal student loan debt. The average debt per borrower is closing in on $40,000, with debtors who graduated expected to pay on average nearly $400 a month. And with most loans taking approximately 30 years to pay off, that means tons of Americans are paying another car payment at least for the length that they are taking to pay off a house. As the pandemic rages on and millions face unemployment, many know some sort of action has to be taken. And this is apparent because the very first bill for pandemic relief passed by Congress, both parties unanimously agreed to put the payment of these loans on hold. Trump even extended that legislation, with President Biden extending it even further on his first day in office. In short, both parties, filled with politicians who put themselves above country all the time, see how important this is to address. But as the topic became a mainstay, not just in 2020, but over the past few years, temporary forgiveness doesn't seem to be nearly enough anymore for many. Leading up to the 2016 presidential election, there was a strong debate within the Democrat Party, with the more liberal and progressive candidates pitching student loan forgiveness as part of their platform. Far left notables such as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders made it a main part of their agendas. And even though Warren and Sanders lost in their primaries, both in 2016 and this past year in 2020, their agenda has become a party-wide platform. Now Biden has embraced it, and it started to become a question of how much and when can it be done, as opposed to will it? Or it seemed to be that question. Countless Democrat congressmen and women signed a request for Biden to eliminate up to $50,000 of federal loan debt per borrower, hoping he would do it on day one. Democrat senators have spoken up for the need for this to happen, and millions of Americans have made it public that they want, or more so need, this relief. Now, as I noted, Biden has only been the president of the United States for 3 months. His focus has been on the pandemic, systematic racism, environmental needs, impeachment trial, and of course, as I mentioned, the pandemic. Not to mention the amount of work his administration has had to do to reverse the follies of Trump's term. This has left little time for immediate student loan forgiveness. But as permanent relief still sits somewhat on the political to-do list, politicians and Americans alike debate not just the need for that relief, but also debate what is the right amount and when. If we're to say we know what to expect and what will be forgiven, or even if it'll be done, we'd be lying. Biden's originally intended to put $10,000 of federal loan forgiveness for all borrowers into his current coronavirus bill. It didn't make it in, and there are a number of good reasons as to why, which we'll get to. But his willingness to finally put a number and a reason has only further ignited the discussion. Right now, there's really no side A or B for the argument, with more so 4 platforms getting the most attention. There is that liberal push for economic relief that calls for the full $50,000 of relief per borrower. Biden played it a little more politically safe with the, as we mentioned, $10,000 per barrio scenario. And there's a largely popular scenario where there's no defined amount, but more so relief for those making less than a certain amount, capping it similar to other things we've done with pandemic aid. And of course, the always uber conservative argument, no relief for anybody, that it's not needed. For lack of a good transition here, let's just get right into the arguments, for and against. And let's start with the argument made by those that did or wanted to attend CPAC earlier this month, the uber conservative. The argument is, what about me? Why should I cover the cost of somebody else who isn't working as hard? The standard white conservative argument. Sadly, almost all Republican platforms are formed around this argument. The quote, I worked hard for mine, nobody else should get a break mentality that is so strongly held up by white boomers that saw the benefits of Reaganomics and fair wages many years ago. Listen, this concept isn't hard. If I have 6 tacos on my plate and my hungry neighbor only has 1 or maybe 0, giving them a few tacos doesn't lead me to starve. It's what those same boomers taught us as a kid to do. It's the help your neighbor mentality that Jesus, the person conservative Republicans so often try to quote, taught for his entire life. Arguments that wide forgiveness isn't fair to other people who have already worked hard to pay off their loans, or those that didn't even take out loans to begin with, magnify a huge selfish issue within America today. It's an issue that doesn't just impact the loan forgiveness conversation, but an argument we see around healthcare, livable wages, and even people's basic rights. Arguments like this immediately dilute any case somebody could make onto why something like wide student loan forgiveness is a bad idea. And although I'll share later why I'm for forgiveness, there would actually be a few cases that caught my ear and make sense that are against it. No matter how you feel about it, the argument that permanent student loan forgiveness doesn't help right now is actually true. These loans are already on hold, and a decision for the government to focus on total loan forgiveness would not impact the economy right now this year. The belief that the government should be focusing on other more pressing matters, such as rolling out vaccines, supporting unemployment, and fighting off evictions, makes a lot of sense. But no matter how you look at that argument against, it's really short-sighted. The argument becomes irrelevant down the road, hopefully sooner rather than later. Eventually, the government has to stop handing us stimulus packages, and our school loan bills will come due again. When that happens, we'll still be on the road to recovery as individuals and a country, and relief ahead of that recovery step could be incredibly beneficial. Countless of surveys over the past few years have shown that millennials and post-millennials done with school wait to buy a house, they wait to get married, and they even wait to start saving for retirement because of one main issue they identify: student loans. Many of those millennials and post-millennials even move back in with their parents now. More and more research is showing that a mass wave of relief would impact that poverty line nearly as much, if not more, than even a minimum wage adjustment, especially for minority communities. This includes one recent academic paper that maintains that, quote, median wealth for Black households overall, not just borrowers, would instantly increase by 42% with $75,000 in student debt forgiveness and around 34% with $50,000 in forgiveness. This argument against truly is strong, and it's part of the reason I haven't started condemning Biden to hell like many young liberals already have. But when it's time for Americans to get out of the house and get back in the game, That extra money to do those big things we need and want to do would change the way business is done for the better in the future. And as I call out that study, it's important to say that for every 4 to 5 studies for forgiveness, there's an apparent study against, leading us to probably one of the stronger arguments against, which is the constant back and forth around how the relief actually does impact the poverty gap. Although studies in favor of a positive impact on the poverty gap, especially around minority communities, are sensical and strong, there are studies that I disagree with that also technically hold some ground. A prime example being an analysis by the People's Policy Project that shows the top fifth of households hold $3 in student loans for every $1 held by the bottom fifth. It makes the case that many student borrowers in low-income quintiles are younger and didn't build the level of debt those with money have. So in the end, those making more already will get larger amounts of forgiveness and move even further ahead. But the counter to this is easily crafted with just some thought and even some careful wording on any order or bill that would come out of DC. The poverty gap is real in this country, and relief can impact it. And if the rich white people in DC are actually being honest when they say they fear forgiveness is helping other rich white people, they simply set a cap. They do it with the stimulus payments. Income is divided in tax brackets for those with more money to pay more taxes, and other federal benefits are halted at certain income levels already. Student debt relief can be crafted in a similar way to where those that need it more still get it. But even putting that aside, as much as it's argued, there isn't really consistent data that shows the forgiveness would widen a poverty gap. Not even close to as much data that shows that it would benefit the gap. The data out there better supports forgiveness of debt at this level would have a positive impact on the racial gap. Every decade, more and more minorities and individuals from lower income communities go to college, and they accrue debt in the process. Like other arguments that have some strength to it initially, this one is quickly shut down with just a little bit of effort, research, and crafted thought. So that moves us on to another loud argument we're seeing from far rights, and that centers around money and the growing national deficit. A deficit that same group of people forget about when they're forming tax relief legislation for the rich the past 4 years. Plain and simple, somebody has to pay the bills at the end of the day, whether it's for supplies and vaccines in a pandemic, to healthcare needs for lower income families every day, or all the way to the $1.7 trillion we're talking about here with student loan debt. First, I think it's an oversight by many. How much does loan forgiveness actually cost those forgiving? It's not the $1.7 trillion, and it definitely isn't a bill to be paid immediately. Nowhere in any plan to forgive student debt does the government have to write itself a $1.7 trillion check. The bill was already paid. How are we missing that? Sure, there's going to be some costs associated with it. Contracts might have to be renegotiated with private businesses, service and legal fees addressed. But without us having a hard and true number attached to what wide forgiveness would truly cost the United States, it's hard to say this argument of impacting the debt that greatly holds really any ground. So that leads us back to probably the most well-rounded argument out there, the fact that student loan forgiveness is a backwards thinking plan. A mass loan forgiveness bill helps those already out of school, but it doesn't account for those still borrowing or yet to borrow. Borrowers that would now be less likely to pay their debts, thinking another wave of student loan forgiveness would be available to them down the road. In the absence of other reforms, forgiving debt sets a precedent. Such a policy might prompt universities, colleges, and other institutions to increase tuition on the expectation that the federal government will absorb much more of the cost going forward. And borrowers likely believing the same would take on those even higher costs of tuition without a plan on being able to pay it. It could lead to a huge boost in the economy now, but even greater school loan debt issues for the generations in the future. And although this is the strongest argument against wide relief, it's also one of the easiest to combat. Reform. Reform is needed. Politicians and policymakers could and should follow up debt relief with a plan to make college affordable and accessible, ideally with direct federal investment in higher education financing. What burdened the current generation of higher education graduates should not be a burden for those still seeking out an education. It's time for the federal government to put thought and time to better regulating how publicly funded universities and colleges manage that tuition. It's time for the DC elite to put together committees and plans for middle schools and high schools to better teach what's ahead and better answer the question, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Trade schools, community college, and other small universities need to be embraced, promoted, and used in a way that better diversifies our future workforce and sets them up for success. I want to take a political detour here for a second. Let's make this clear. Most of the politicians in DC are not champions for student loan forgiveness. Trump is definitely not a champion for student loan forgiveness, no matter what he claims. In fact, across 2020, he vetoed multiple congressional bills that had bipartisan support. But that's not a surprise. We already knew Trump never cared about middle-class Americans, especially those that don't join the cult of MAGA. Yet, knowing that strengthens the fact that his willingness to extend even temporary relief shows that this is a big enough deal. It's crossed those unbreakable party and wealth lines, meaning both parties are starting to see that need for a change in the way student loans are handled and the current student debt crisis. At least some small change. Listen, I know I point out Trump a lot on these podcasts. He's a terrible racist shrill. But I've also noted today multiple times that Biden's willingness to make this an agenda item and then not do anything about it shows that this is not a simple issue erased by one person with a single signature. But what's next for the student loan forgiveness discussion? Will there actually be debt forgiveness in 2021? The answer to how much relief, and if there will be any, is really truly hard to determine still. Although Biden has a staunch list of reasons to have put this on the back burner for the first 3 months, especially after extending that deferral period, his backtracking on what to do in the long run is not good, and it's not being taken lightly by many. His dance makes one wonder if he took up the platform to get a far more liberal base to support him instead of just not voting, and that abandonment was always going to be inevitable. His claim is that Congress needs to take this up. But as we're already seeing, those slim lines of control the Democrats have over both the House and Senate are leading to very little progress as well. Many politicians, scholars, and even those in the legal field believe Biden has the ability to wipe out mass amounts of debt with just his signature. And truly, there's no debt for the government to take on, at least not as $1.7 trillion. The removal of these loans does not cost the federal government that much because it's already been paid. And let us not forget, the national deficit has long been ballooning before this crazy turn of events in 2020. A turn of events that should have us worrying less about that national deficit and more about keeping food on our tables. I have an opinion on the matter. I have plenty of opinions, obviously. I mean, it's why I do this show. But I do believe there is an obvious right answer here for this relief, at least on the surface. There are millions of low-income and middle-income families, as well as young people without the fallback of family wealth, that are burdened, and giving money or relief to wealthier borrowers by accident shouldn't prevent something that can help those that are less fortunate. That is, if we can't determine a cap, which I talked about earlier. The problem that comes up time and time again in the country is, what about the other group? We shouldn't be asking that question ever. If somebody needs help, we give that group help. If somebody isn't being treated equally, we find an immediate way to treat them equally. And if we do something and it helps those in need, and for some reason it helps those that weren't in as much need, then so be it. What's ahead for this country is something we've never seen before. Right now, we can't even forecast tomorrow. Retailers saw their worlds flip upside down. Restaurants and small businesses are closing left and right. People can't pay bills. Forgiving student loans may not put dollars in the economy in March 2021, but it'll do it in March 2022. And yeah, some of those dollars will go to large corporations, but a lot of them will go to mom and pop restaurants. A lot of them will go to small regional businesses employing your neighbors. Businesses of all shapes and sizes will be recovering from what 2020 brought for years to come. And vastly more important, so will the people. There are a lot of years ahead, and the forgiveness of school loans, whether it's $10,000 or the more needed $50,000 per borrower, leads to positive opportunities for everybody. So when we're faced with the question as a country, should we do this? this thing that benefits so many, positively impacts poverty and racial gaps, and makes us wiser in the future? The answer should always be yes, because giving everybody the same opportunity should be what America stands on today. That's our show. Diving Deep is, well, diving deep in 2021. Social media, defining socialism, school loans, the movie industry, comic conventions, and yep, politics are all on the agenda this year. Stay tuned every other Monday for more Diving Deep, where we dive deep into the topics that need to be discussed. And for more exciting Project Nerd podcasts, head over to projectnerd.com/podcast to find over a dozen active series across multiple topics and genres. That's project-nerd.com/podcasts.